secret. Now, growing concern about animal welfare is being linked to new worries about the quality and the safety of the food we eat. We're at the heart of an operation that's typical of food and farming in Britain today. This is the Unigate Company's chicken processing factory on Humberside. It aims to produce food at the lowest cost through intensive production that keeps the factory supplied with up to 1 million chickens a week. Surrounding the factory are 26 farm units which hatch, rear and grow the broiler chickens. They illustrate our fears about food safety, our factory farming and the secrecy that surrounds it. Unigate refused permission to film, but we went to have a look all the same. There are 40,000 birds here living for 49 days on top of their own manure. In general, up to a quarter of broiler flocks may carry the disease Salmonella. Some Salmonella strains have become resistant to antibiotics, a serious hazard to human health. Ben Walker was 2, a healthy boy with no problems. But suddenly he fell ill with a stomach upset that got worse and worse. Increasingly worried that this was no ordinary childhood illness, his parents took him to hospital.
The first doctors that saw him actually took a nappy off. Bearing in mind, 2-year-old, he shouldn't be in a nappy anyway, but there's only way we could keep him clean. And he saw the blood in the stools and that, and he just says, "Oh yeah, that's Salmonella, I can recognise that." And took him through to the baby ward, where they says, we'll give him a large dose of these antibiotics, which will, they're common, he says, so until we actually find a strain, he'll cover everything. And his body didn't react to these antibiotics, so things went from bad to worse. He's septicemia, and then his kidneys failed.
In most cases, Salmonella just makes people ill. But in Ben's, a particularly virulent strain called Salmonella enteritidis invaded his bloodstream and killed him. Naturally, his parents wanted to know how Ben had got Salmonella and where it had come from. Was it their fault? Was anyone else to blame? There was an official inquiry. First, the Walkers' home was closely examined. No Salmonella was found in the house, nor was Wendy Walker, Ben's mother, carrying it. But her sister, Ben's aunt, was. The inquiry thought it unlikely she was the source of Ben's Salmonella, but the day after he fell ill, she went to work alongside her sister and was later found to be carrying the same strain of the disease. Both women had worked at Unigate's chicken hatchery in Scunthorpe.
My job here was to sex chicks, to put them into the respective sexes by using the wing, which was throwing one to one side and one to the other. We sat along a conveyor belt with our knees under the conveyor. So as the chicken dirt was dropping through, it dropped onto your knees and soaked through your boiler suit, onto your jeans or whatever you was wearing.
So muck from the chickens was getting onto you?
That's right. And you was taking it home on your shoes, on your jumper sleeves, in your hair, fluff in your hair, anything like that.
You realised that was happening at the time?
I did, but I never thought anything. We were never told anything, we were never given any warning, so I just thought, well, there was nothing to it.
The inquiry condemned hygiene at the hatchery as clearly inadequate. The same Salmonella enteritidis type 4 that had killed Ben was found in the plant and in the hatchery eggs. But then another test was tried. Here at the Public Health Laboratories in Colindale, North London, they applied a new technique called plasmid profiling. This showed that Ben's type 4 Salmonella was not precisely the same as the Salmonella found in the hatchery. Unigate solicitors say this established beyond any doubt whatsoever that the Salmonella strain responsible for Benjamin's death did not emanate from our client's hatchery. But we've discovered that's simply not the case. Colindale has now told us when the plasmid profiles are different, This cannot prove conclusively that a strain isolated from a human case did not arise from a particular source. Work at Leeds University confirms plasmid profiling is less important than the Salmonella type.
This is a very accurately identified strain, Enteritidis type 4. We know it comes from eggs and poultry. To me, the simple explanation, the obvious explanation, is that the mother brought it home after working in the factory, clothes and so on, and passed it on to a small toddler. This is likely, we know this happens. The identification of this bacterium in these three sources is much more important than this speculative plasmid profiling that really doesn't help at all.
So that can't be relied upon?
Not at all, no.
Their solicitor believes the Walkers have a good case. The same dangerous type of salmonella that killed Ben Walker was found inside the hatchery in the Unigate system. But Mark and Wendy simply don't have the money to take the company to court.
Would be a good idea, putting them right.
The Walkers feel their family may have discovered the real cost of intensive food production. Food safety is now a more important political issue than crime, the poll tax or the cost of living. And at the same time as consumers have lost confidence in the Ministry of Agriculture's ability to look after their interests, the farm animal welfare lobby is stepping up its efforts. JOANNA Lumley believes food safety and good animal husbandry are related.
If they weren't farmed so intensively, in fact, they wouldn't contract these diseases, which would then not harm human health. I think if we're going to use animals for food, we should husband them more carefully and, in that way, protect the human race as well.
These piglets have their teeth clipped to prevent them injuring the mother sow. To stop them biting each other, their tails are docked. These procedures are regularly used when pigs are raised intensively, packed together under conditions of stress, where natural behaviour is impossible. To make them put on weight as fast as possible, they're given an antibiotic in their feed, which acts as a growth promoter. Meanwhile, their mothers are starting a new pregnancy chained to the floor, as they will be virtually all their lives. The government admits this system fails to meet welfare standards, but it's typical of the way we raise animals for our food. And many farmers see nothing wrong with this factory farming.
They're well fed, they're watered, they've got straw bedding. Again, I don't see, you say it's against nature, but to me, provided the animal is well fed, well cared for, I see no problem.
Pig producers in general often use large doses of antibiotics to control the diseases that come with closely packed animals. Drugs, potentially dangerous to humans, have frequently been found in pigs after slaughter. A former drug company microbiologist, Alan Long, now advises the Vegetarian Society.
It's called brinkmanship farming, that's what farmers call it, which is to drive animals into production to the very limit of their physiological capacity. It's because people want cheap meat, they want to push production, they want to cut the costs, cut the corners, and instead of looking after the animals with good stockmanship and taking more individual care, they use drugs, they use crowding, the animals get injured, and then they get more drugs, and in that way you get a build-up of disease.
Some farmers won't go along with factory farming methods. In Wiltshire, the Real Meat Company has established a network of individual farmers who agree to raise their animals in a more natural way according to a clear set of rules. It's proving a commercially successful formula.
Because I came in from the meat business from the outside, I knew what was wrong, knew what people were worried about, and was able to say, OK, I'm going to produce meat the way it should be produced, here it is, and the response from the public's been dramatic.
What is wrong with the way we raise animals now?
Well, if you take the most intensively reared ones, pigs and chickens, I think there are practices going on that I think are downright cruel. And in fact, the farmers who do it are very lucky that it takes place inside closed buildings where the public can't see it, because I think if more of the public knew about it, the more would resist it.
All across the British countryside, farming is going on largely in secret, hidden from our gaze. Inside anonymous, windowless buildings, animals are being raised in ways which the farmers know we wouldn't like. We've found it easier to film the nuclear industry than show you how our eggs and bacon are produced. And some high street food retailers have been just as difficult to film as most farmers. Marks and Spencer said no to us. So did Safeway. And so too did Sainsbury. This is Sainsbury's experimental free-range pig farm in Norfolk, where they raise pigs in a more natural way. Sainsbury's said we could show you this, but only if we agreed not to film their other typically intensive farms. When we said no, Sainsbury's withdrew cooperation. We thought we should show you their other farms all the same, so we went to have a look. This is where Sainsbury's pork and bacon is actually produced. The pigs we saw were clearly being raised in a pretty intensive way. Some of the pens had bare slatted floors. This is to allow the manure to fall through. In effect, the pigs are living over an open sewer. In one shed we saw sows that had just produced their little piglets. They were penned in metal crates, designed to stop them turning round and squashing their young. There's nothing unusual about this crate system, although there's evidence it's not much, if at all, more effective than leaving the sows to get on with it naturally. A tray of drugs caught our cameraman's eye. We could see hypodermic needles, an antibiotic spray, and what could have been vitamins. But the farm stockman, who'd now caught up with us, suddenly became agitated, trying to stop us filming the drugs as his assistant carried them away. Why was he worried? Now that we'd got our film, Sainsbury's decided to talk to us.
It's because of general media programs suggesting that we are administering drugs for the wrong reasons that he's naturally concerned. And although there wasn't any particular medication there which was in focus, the concern here clearly he had was that he was confused.
Of course, animals need a vet, just like humans need a doctor. But most human homes don't have hypodermic syringes and needles routinely on hand. Aren't you worried you're relying too much on drugs for animals?
No, because in the standards we use in Sainsbury's, we only use the highest standards in all
well, I'm sure
aspects
you do, but
of
are you
husbandry.
relying too much on drugs?
No, because they are only administered under veterinary supervision by a trained stockman.
The determination to get the last ounce out of every farm animal has led to unnatural feeding practices. Animal remains are processed and fed back to animals that wouldn't normally eat meat. It's now well understood that this recycling may infect animals without the right defences, and that these animals will then pass into the human food chain. A quarter of all protein processing plants have been found to be contaminated. New regulations are meant to ensure that there are positive checks before animal protein is delivered to the feed compounders. Some of them are so worried they're insisting that animal protein is made only from meat fit for human consumption, but that's certainly not a legal requirement. And animal protein has become a vital part of intensive food production.
Well, to me, it's an extremely valuable raw material which the feeding stuffs industry has used for many years. It's very high protein, and therefore, in particular rations for particular livestock, it can be a very useful ingredient.
Well, this is how the government defines animal protein. It's any material which may be used for feeding to livestock or poultry which contains the whole of any part of any dead animal or bird. It includes blood, hatchery waste, eggs, eggshells, hair, horns, hides, hoofs, feathers and manure, and any material which contains human effluent. Well, how do you feel about feeding animal and human excrement to animals that we're going to eat?
Yes, it sounds pretty awful put like that, but it's a bit misleading. The list had to be as it was for legal reasons, I think. In practice, I don't know of any feed that now includes any sort of manure, whether from humans or animals. I think that just doesn't happen.
But animal manure is being fed to animals. Back on Humberside, we found enormous heaps of chicken manure from Unigate's broiler houses still full of dead chickens. A planning inspector recently decided that Unigate gave misleading information as to how it was going to get rid of manure from one particular site. The company's told us it sells the manure for spreading on the land. But local anti-Unigate campaigners have discovered where at least some of this hazardous waste is really going.
Well, we saw a lorry being loaded with chicken manure saying animal feedstuffs, and we were curious as to find out what type of animal feedstuffs could have chicken manure in it, so we followed it. After sort of quite a long journey through Lincolnshire, we ended up at a farm and discovered from talking to some farm workers that it's actually mixed into cattle feed.
It's no ordinary farm to which chicken manure is being delivered. This series of feedlots, stretching for 34 acres across the Lincolnshire hillside, is unique in Britain. It can hold up to 4,000 cows at a time. Like the farm itself, the cow's feed is unusual. Waste vegetable material mixed with molasses and chicken manure. The cattle baron who owns the farm at first wouldn't speak to us, but later he told us he'd seen nothing nasty in the manure he'd been feeding his cows.
We have not seen, and my farm manager would support this, we've not seen any dead birds ever in our materials.
Bit surprising, isn't it? It wasn't hard for us to see it.
Well, I don't know, you know, what you've seen, but I can only go from my own point of view. And I can only go from where that we've never seen any, and we've never had any case or any concern or worry that there was any disease.
Mr. Butelaar says that before it's fed to the cows, the chicken manure is allowed to cook itself clear of any infection. It's a legal process and approved by the government, but only if it's done with care. And while the process might kill salmonella, it might not deal with still more serious diseases like botulism.
Well, it's highly dangerous. We know instinctively we don't like the recycling of animal feeds and manure. And we know why now. We know that the various bacteria can be moved around. And we know that the use of chicken manure to cattle can cause botulism. I understand that in the last year there have been 200 cases in Australia of cattle getting botulism from being fed chicken manure. This particular bacterium, Clostridium botulinum, is very, very tough. It's heat resistant. And I think sooner or later there will be an accident whereby a large number of cattle get botulism.
As ever, the worry is that animals with a fatal disease could get into the human food chain. Mr. Butelaar has now told us that none of the cows fed on chicken manure at his farm are sold for the British market, but are instead all exported to Africa. We were not allowed to film at his slaughterhouse or at his meat processing plant. But Butelaar companies do supply some of the most popular food retailers with meat products. The Co-op has bought Butelaar's frozen hamburgers. Gateway has had its own label hamburgers made by Butelaar, and McDonald's have bought Butelaar meat to make into hamburgers themselves. Do you think that people buying hamburgers in Britain's high streets, hamburgers that you make or made from meat you provide to these high street stores, do you think people would like to know that that meat comes from a farm where some of the animals are being fed chicken manure, however it's processed?
Well, let me put it straight. None of the animals which goes into the high street and the meat derived from these animals go into are being fed with protein derived from chicken litter.
Farmers are increasingly feeding cattle chicken manure instead of the meat and bone meal thought responsible for mad cow disease. Although his farm handles thousands of cows a year, Mr. Butelaar says he's never had a single case of BSE. But for other farmers, it's been devastating. 4 times as many cases of BSE are now occurring as were predicted. No one yet knows exactly what the agent causing these symptoms is, how it's transmitted, and whether humans can get it by eating infected animals, just as cows seem to have done. Like it or not, all of us who are meat eaters are now involved in an experiment for years to come. While the risk to any one of us is very small, that risk remains. Research published last week tends to confirm the disease is essentially the same in both animals and man. It also suggests it may not always be possible to identify it with ordinary microscopic examination, and that in man it may already be much more common than previously recognised. Working with human brains, Dr. Gareth Roberts thinks a proportion of those who are normally diagnosed as having some form of senile dementia actually have the human version of BSE.
If 75,000 people a year die of dementia in this country, that gives you a figure of around 1,500. I think that may be a reasonable starting point. But then, on top of that, there's about 10% of people who die of dementia who never get a diagnosis neuropathologically because we're not certain what the changes are that occur in their brain. If you look at that 10% figure, it gives you a top figure of about 9,000 cases a year. Now, I think that's an extreme and is probably not the true figure at all. The true figure is probably somewhere between 1,500 and 9,000.
Given the risk that BSE might just be transmissible to humans, slaughterhouses have got to take particular care in case the cow is infected. The vast majority of British slaughterhouses, like this one, don't meet European Community standards. Some of the butchering here took place on the ground, which could spread infection. Even with the carcass off the floor, risks remain if saw and knives aren't frequently sterilised. New regulations now require the spinal cord, which might harbour BSE, to be carefully removed and separately disposed of. But the fact is, veterinary inspectors report that nearly half of Britain's abattoirs don't maintain minimum hygiene standards. The government's advisers have warned that high-pressure hoses could be spreading BSE. That they're still being used shows just how slowly food production practices change. There are 60,000 battery hens stacked 5 rows high in this one shed. Each hen has a space about half the size of the average television screen to live in for 54 weeks before its laying life is over. Though it's nearly 10 years since the Commons Agriculture Committee called for the phasing out of battery cages, nothing has been done to liberate these hens. Battery systems become ever more mechanically perfect, at least on big farms like this one in the south of England, which sells 4 million eggs a week. The company says it's now responding to demand for free-range eggs, but 6,000 birds in a few large groups in one fixed hen house seems to be doing it on such a commercial scale that it can hardly be called free range, though legally it is. So many hens competing together has meant that their beaks have had to be trimmed, but they're still pecking away at each other. So why not house them in smaller units?
That was the technology that my father used 50 years ago.
Why
do we have to repeat all the mistakes that my father made? Surely we must have the opportunity to make use of today's technology, the feeding system, the mucking out, the ability to provide the water and the feed without any labour input whatsoever. Why shouldn't we have the houses connected together so that we can control the ventilation to provide the right temperature in winter as well as in summer?
Well, I see the advantages to you from a point of looking after the birds, but if it means de-beaking them and seeing them peck each other like this, I wonder if it's not being done on too big a scale.
But I'm not sure that it's something you can eliminate just by getting the scale smaller.
But being smaller can work. It's better from the animal welfare point of view, and despite what factory farmers often say, raising animals intensively, often using drugs to keep disease at bay, isn't necessarily the best way to help animals produce healthy, safe food for humans. Julian Rose says his hens have never yet had salmonella.
In some cases.
How about disease problems?
We don't have any disease problems. It's
None at all?
No, absolutely none.
Well, what do you do to prevent it? What about vaccinations and all that?
Well, we have no vaccinations and we use no particular methods to control disease because the disease doesn't seem to strike.
No antibiotics or anything?
No, absolutely not. And you see the hens run around so much outside. They stretch their legs, they flap their wings, they get a good healthy outdoor life, and they build up their natural immunity to disease this way, just as human beings do if they have a good healthy outdoor life as well.
Julian Rose's free-range eggs cost more because of the extra labour involved. Why do people pay that extra money?
I think people are waking up to the problems that intensively farmed animal systems are now bringing up. And I don't think they want to think that their eggs are coming from those systems. He'd rather pay a little bit more from something which was like this. It seems to be the way people are now thinking.
So they roam wild in these very woods?
Really?
Dudley Moores had to go abroad in search of quality chickens to sell to the British housewife. These are the men from Tesco who found them. In the forests of southwest France, Tesco have discovered a curious-looking hen that's produced under relatively natural conditions. Tesco still does plenty of cheap, intensively produced broilers, but these expensive free-range birds are now 9% of their total poultry sales. Why do you think people are prepared to pay more?
Because of what they're getting. It's the quality we're offering, the flavour we're offering, and the environmental issues and the animal welfare issues.
And I think that when we go through the 90s, more and more customers, being aware of themselves and their influence on the environment through their purchases, are going to put more and more demands on us for food produced in ways which bring together some of the practices that you can see so well demonstrated here.
In the end, all animals raised to feed us are going to be killed. Some people simply don't want to know about that kind of food. But those of us who do want to go on eating meat are increasingly demanding that farm animals should be treated in a way that means a decent existence for them while they live and safer, better quality food for us. If we really want better food, we're going to have to pay more for it. And we're going to have to stop feeding animals unnatural diets to extract every...